coming all the way over to spend this afternoon. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
For being here. This is actually not your first visit, I'm proud to say, at SIPA in Colombia. She came to our inaugural conference, which we created about 3 years ago, Digital Futures Policy Forum. Mm-hmm. And we've been continuing that ever since. And I think there's a really exciting and broadening conversation occurring in New York and on our campus, bringing law and policy and technologists together to discuss digital economy and cybersecurity issues in a global context in a very multi-dimensional fashion. So I think we're going to cover some of that landscape in this conversation, and I thank you. What I thought I'd do is start on a few themes and then open it up for questions, comments from people who are with us, and I think we have a fairly large online community as well. So thank you for that. Let me just share with you a little bit about our guest's remarkable background. As you know, she's at the center of these issues as a member of the European Parliament for the Dutch Democratic Party, where I think you have served since 2009. Mm-hmm. She's also serves on the International Trade Committee, where she's also an important spokesperson on transatlantic trade and digital trade. You're also the founder of a European parliamentary group on the digital agenda for Europe, as well as a member of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Mm-hmm. So whether it's in your parliamentary role or in your broader advocacy, you're just deeply enmeshed in these issues. And she also serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Subcommittee on Human Rights. And I note that in 2017, you were also chief of the European Union Election Observation Mission in Kenya. I really commend you for that and for the range of things you're doing. So really hard to know where to start.
I'm feeling like that myself by now. So.
In this topic. But as a European official and politician, maybe we could just start with Europe, because Europe has, after many years and many issues, developed this new GDPR regulation. It's coming into effect in Europe. You've also introduced in Europe the single digital market. And so the privacy and security and trade issues, I think, are reflected in those two pieces of legislation, and a desire to make Europe more of a market and one that is appropriately, in the European view, balancing these interests. So could you just share a sense of how you feel where is Europe? Have you struck the right balance? Do you feel like the outcome of these frameworks is a more integrated, properly protected, and still innovative environment around digital matters?
Thank you. First of all, thank you all. Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be at Columbia and to see your leadership in this evolving field. It's very important to have research, fact-based discussions, because also when it comes to cyber, there's still a lot of myths floating around. And I think it's wonderful to see the intersection of public policy and academia towards this direction. So congratulations for that, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for being here, and for the people watching online. Where is Europe? There's a lot to be said about that, but let me try to break it down a little bit. The efforts to build a single market also for the digital economy are really ongoing, and there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. So there, I think we're taking steps in the right direction, but for me it's not going fast enough at all. The digital single market is really a package of all kinds of measures to try to remove unnecessary barriers that still exist between countries, regulations, and sort of legacy legislation, and to try to make it one harmonized space. Of course, the promise of the single market at all, offline or online, is to create the free flow of capital, goods, services, and people. And this should then also go for knowledge, let's say, right? Or for the online space. But imagine that we are 28 countries where there are 28 different copyright laws, consumer protection laws, parcel delivery laws, privacy laws, etc. So the goal of the package for the digital single market is to create one predictable, level playing field for consumers, small, medium-sized enterprises, American tech companies, what have you. And we're still in the middle of that. So that's one part of the question. The other part of the question I think is about the EU taking a role as a norm setter in the digital space, the digital economy. And there, I believe we are increasingly successful and also recognized globally as doing that. You mentioned the GDPR, which I think is one of the big products of this norm setting. But we've also established net neutrality, for example, in EU law, which is now under pressure again in the United States, of course, under the Trump administration. And I hope that the EU will continue to take this normative approach to the digital environment, because I think one of the key challenges we have in strengthening the open internet, our open societies, looking at how to navigate the disruptive and revolutionary impact of new technologies, is to make sure that the rule of law applies online as well. And this is a phrase we often hear, right? Laws that apply offline should also apply online. But how to transpose, how to make sure it actually happens, how to make sure you have a sense of whether competition is fair, whether there is non-discrimination on tech platforms. Is it as easy for a black person to rent out a room on Airbnb as it is for a white person? And if there is a difference, how come? The very principles that are really not that controversial, fair competition, non-discrimination, freedom of expression, access to information, they sound like common good, but it's a real challenge for us as lawmakers to see how the rule of law retains its meaning and gets translated into laws in the online world.
So let's talk, if I may, a little bit more about the norm setting. One of the things that has always been really impressive to me about Europe is the balance that Europe has struggled with, given the complexity of the number of jurisdictions that you're stitching together. And so subsidiarity was a great guiding principle for those things that had to be regulated at the EU level while allowing diversity in member states. So when you talk about norm setting within Europe for the world, it just makes me ask, what are those norms that you think should be exported, and then how much of the heterogeneity of the world does Europe need to have tolerance for? I guess is sort of what I'm wondering if you could amplify for us.
Sure. So, just to be clear, our core focus is to make sure that the rights of Europeans are protected in Europe. So I do think there is a space for global norms to protect the open internet and internet users, but that's a slightly separate discussion from policies that we're making in the EU that should apply for European citizens first and foremost. But indeed, we are still in a process of harmonizing the regulatory space. It's sort of similar to what you're experiencing here in the US, where you have a federal system. Some decisions are made for the entire country. Other decisions can be made on the state level. There's a constant battle about this, sometimes fought out before courts. Who's in charge? How should this work? It's fairly similar to what we're seeing in Europe. But if we zoom out for a moment and look at this global internet and see how it was designed as a place that was open, where innovation was permissionless, where everyone could, in theory, with access to the internet, have access to any other point on the net, any website, any content, etc., as an ideal. Speak to some of the creators of the internet and listen to this ideal with which they built it. But the reality that we're increasingly facing is one of fragmentation. We see countries trying to fence off the internet in parallel to their own territorial space. I mean, extreme examples, but still relevant, are the Islamic Republic of Iran that wants to create a halal internet, entirely nationalized, entirely censored, entirely controlled. Now, thankfully, people are quite clever and find ways to access the open internet, the global internet, but the idea that there's a battle for power between states and internet users, between states and sort of their objectives, political views, is something that is becoming more prominent. And besides the role of states and governments in what they're allowing their citizens to experience online, we see that the profit models of some of the big companies, or the power that some of the big companies have, also allow them to play a significant role in setting norms. I mean, we spoke a little bit about how the EU is setting norms, but imagine the power that big tech platforms have in terms of determining the order in which you see information, whether or not it's appropriate to see pictures of certain things displayed or not. So the question, again, of what rules and laws should apply online and how do we make sure that that's enforceable, I believe will pull us out of merely the country's territory or the EU's territory, but will probably increasingly go to a global conversation about minimal agreements that we can find. And Secretary General Guterres of the UN also spoke about this recently. So this is a discussion that is now being held at the UN,
Yes.
And that we see also between different stakeholders. So states, private sector, civil society, internet users, to think about, in an ideal world, what are the minimum agreements that we need to prevent war, to be waged online or in cyberspace, as some people call it. How do we make sure, and in my ideal world, rights are universal, how do we make sure that those universal rights continue to apply for people online as well?
Thank you. So one of the areas where I was thinking of it also rather narrowly on the question of the privacy issues, because they've been so hot. And, we've gone from the invalidation of the safe harbor to this new privacy shield, and I guess the legal status of that is not fully resolved, but it is the way that we're moving forward, and that in addition with the GDPR is what we've got at the moment. Is it working? Is it a stable framework for the time being, or what is your sense of? And is it one that that adequately really weighs the degree of protections that exist around the world? I mean, it sometimes seems to me that we have very different systems between the U.S. and the EU, and of course, Europe is deeply concerned about U.S. having access to European information. I know that's been a key driver around these tensions, but I'd be interested if you could comment on these frameworks today.
Yes. So I think it's important to appreciate the starting point for many Europeans, where I think there's a stronger historic sense of the importance of protecting people from their governments.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, in the United States, the sort of promise or motto is that Americans don't want government interference. I mean, the whole discussion about gun laws, I think, is based on this notion of, I'll determine for myself, how to protect my territory, etc. Let's keep the government out. But when it comes to national security, I think Americans accept quite a bit of, responsibilities for government and also interference in their lives. In Europe, because of history perhaps, or because of our legal system, combination of both presumably, there is more sensitivity about the role of government and the protection of the individual's privacy and fundamental rights. So the right to privacy in Europe is a fundamental right. And so how to protect this then? The GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, will enter into force in May.
Yeah.
And so we will have to see how it plays out in practice, but it is certainly a very ambitious regulation, and I look forward to seeing how it's going to play out in practice. I'm sure there'll be some challenges to iron out. It's probably easier for bigger companies with big legal teams to think about compliance than it is for SMEs, and governments are helping and informing citizens about what may come. So it's ambitious, we'll have to see how it goes, but I do think it is a natural translation of the protection of the rights of Europeans offline to the online world. And it is actually quite common that when you have a market or a space that your regulations apply there. So for example, we have laws about animal testing or genetically modified organisms. And so if American companies want to sell their products on the European market, they have to comply with these rules. And they would comply with American standards for the sales on the American market. And that's normal. European companies also produce in line with American regulations if they want to sell here. And so that the notion that this would also translate to the digital economy, I think, is perfectly normal. Now, specifically on the Privacy Shield and the safe harbor agreements between the EU and the US, they are attempts at making a predictable regulatory space for the exchange of information. And I think having such a frame is better than not having agreements. Hopefully they can also build trust and confidence between the two transatlantic partners. But there's also some work that still needs to be done there. Yes. I think Europeans would like to see more commitment from the American side. Also appointment of some key figures is still pending, like an ombudsperson. Ombudsman, I think, is the proper word even. To deal with challenges in the execution of the Privacy Shield. And I know that there's a pending legislation here too, the Cloud Act.
Yes.
Which will again, seek to address some of the questions of information sharing, under what conditions, and who decides. And this is, of course, a logical friction between territoriality of law and the global nature of the internet.
Yes.
And in an ideal world, I would actually like to see the EU and the US work together more closely, because I think despite our differences, and there are many, when you zoom out and look at the world, a lot of our history, a lot of our values, a lot of our laws are actually more similar than they are different, especially compared to other parts of the world. And I think we need to hold tight as the liberal democracies of this world, as the open economies of this world, as the open societies of this world, and as the stewards of the open internet.
Yes, no, I completely agree with you, which is why I was thinking about, the differences between our systems. We have to navigate ways that we can continue to work with each other without trying to harmonize each other's systems. I think that's sort of one of the big challenges of the day, and we've found pathways in some areas of regulatory heterogeneity, but this one is still at an early stage, and sort of the externalities of our policies are great. So, we're trying to bring the university into GDPR compliance right now, and it's raising all sorts of complexities that, we're still trying to navigate so that we can, properly admit Europeans in our system, for example. So
yeah.
I feel like, we're learning every day on the effects across borders of these policies. But let me ask you if I could zoom out even more. And this is kind of an unfair question, so I apologize in advance. But one does ask, why is it that some of these big companies are American, right, or Chinese? Why isn't Europe producing Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc.? Are there features? How do you think about that? Because clearly, we think of it here often as a function of our venture capital, availability of capital for early stage companies, and the role of great universities. We pride ourselves thinking as we're creating people who are entrepreneurial. But we also think of it as the regulatory framework has been conducive to, and we've provided some protections for these companies at an earlier stage. So as we think now about new regulatory frameworks for what are big companies, how do you think about that mix of things that is going to create those innovations within Europe and elsewhere? Let's start there.
So, in my opinion, bigger is not always better. I think it's admirable what has been created as an ecosystem in this country when it comes to, indeed, access to capital, access to talent, also through immigration, very important, good universities, and very entrepreneurial spirit. Sometimes out of necessity, because the safety net is simply not as strong as it is in Europe. So the idea that you have to make it on your own, I think, is culturally very strong here, and risk-taking is more rewarded than punished. If you go bankrupt or you have a failed company once, it's not seen as a problem, but maybe more as a badge of honor. You've fallen down, you've crawled back up again. It's different than how I'm generalizing, but how it works in Europe. Sometimes also practically. I mean, the dealing with a bankruptcy can take very long, for example, in Europe, which makes it harder to then pick up again and start a new company. But let's not simplify too much. One, I think the sort of merit of extraordinarily big companies, like the big American tech companies, the big Chinese tech companies, may well be scrutinized more as we go forward. There's questions of whether these are effectively monopolies, whether that's healthy. And these are questions that are being asked out loud in American media. This is not only a European discussion. Sure. You may have seen in the New York Times Magazine of the past weekend about, is Google getting too big? Or forget the title, but it was a huge article about how they've sort of systematically pushed out competition. As a classical liberal, I believe competition is good for innovation. So I'm not sure whether such huge players in the market are actually inviting innovation. I think when net neutrality is actually no longer safeguarded here, that competition will be less fair. The bigger players will get even bigger. We'll have to see what the impact will be on innovation. Then in Europe, I think we have to do a lot of work in order to create such an enabling environment for entrepreneurship specifically. But on a sort of more decentralized level, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. I'm from Amsterdam myself. It's a huge tech hub. And I'm quite happy to see what's happening there. It may not always be super big, but it doesn't make it less meaningful. I also believe that even strict privacy regulations can lead to innovations, because of course the challenge of creating services and applications and products that comply with that new regulation is a whole new market in and of itself. So I don't necessarily buy the argument that more regulation is bad for innovation. It's really a question of what kind of regulations. And yes, we see differences there. And yes, I would love to see more European successes. But I also see some obstacles that we may never overcome. I mean, we are a place in the world with many different languages. Here you have 300 million citizens that roughly speak one or broadly two key languages. So if you have a product that works, you can roll it out very fast all over the United States. If I'm Dutch and I have a product that works, how do I reach a Finnish consumer, a Spanish consumer, a Greek consumer, a Hungarian consumer, right? It's not only a challenge in terms of regulations, which is something we need to work on, but these language differences will always also be a bit of an obstacle in order to understand where opportunities might lie.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that complexity, but I'm always struck by the talent in Europe and wondering how the environment could be more conducive even. So I think you've said that you believe that these big companies, tech companies, need more regulation, and that's a debate we're, I think, at the early stages of here in a pretty vigorous way. But there's there's content regulation issue, content-related regulation under debate. What's the responsibility of these companies with respect to content? And then there's market-based behavior, which is antitrust and so forth. And I think you've spoken to both sets of issues. So And of course, Europe has introduced some rulings with respect to, taking down content, but less in terms of management of content on the part of these, particularly Facebook. So how do you think about those issues? Could you share a little bit?
Yeah. So I'm very, very skeptical and critical about the outsourcing of the responsibility for what content can be online or should be taken down.
Mm-hmm.
So indeed, in Europe, we have seen a push out from, for example, the European Commission to these big platforms to actually tweak their algorithms and take down terrorist content, child pornography, the worst kind of content, content over which copyright has not been adequately paid for, but now also in the context of quote-unquote fake news, which I think is a whole new discussion that is very hot here too.
Yes, indeed.
The tendency to say that big tech companies have created this problem, let them fix it. And the eagerness with which these tech platforms are saying, yeah, fine, don't regulate us. We'll tweak our algorithms, we'll fix this, I think is a slippery slope. Because again, freedom of expression, access to information, it is so fundamental in a democracy. And how do we know what the decisions are that algorithms that impact hundreds of millions of people's access to information, how do we know the way in which they're designed and the way in which they're functioning? In other words, where is the oversight? Which laws are these decisions built upon? Is it a law or is it the terms of service? Is it a decision that an algorithm makes to take down a picture of a statue in Italy because it's too sexually explicit? I mean, I had the experience myself, much to my surprise actually, that I uploaded a speech that I did, a very short 1-minute speech, in the European Parliament in a debate. So public speech, quite valued here under the First Amendment, I think, as any speech should be. And it was taken down by YouTube. And so I was very surprised, wondering why, because I really, to the best of my knowledge, didn't say anything that would even be remotely, illegal or whatever. Maybe a bit boring, but as far as I know, that's not illegal yet. But the topic of the debate was anti-torture. And so my hunch was that maybe the word torture had triggered some kind of scrutiny of the debate. But I put a screenshot of the takedown on Twitter, another social media platform, and I said, I wonder what happened, right? YouTube took down my video. And it didn't take too long before Google called me and wanted to figure out, what had happened. But I'm not the average citizen, obviously, and I'm sure they were not so happy that it was all public, that YouTube had taken down my video, and I wrote a blog about it, was shared a huge amount of times. But if you're an average citizen and your post has been taken down, even if it's only for a couple of hours, what are you going to do? What if you're Alexei Navalny? I interviewed him yesterday in a seminar that we organized on EU-Russia relations. And you've put a post on Instagram. You're an opposition politician that is put in jail without much reason in Russia all the time. And then Instagram decides to take down your post. Instagram being owned by Facebook, etc. I mean, these decisions are very fundamental. And the fact that there is no oversight really about why and how these decisions are made, whether it's made by human beings on the basis of law or by algorithms on the basis of profit, these are such fundamental questions that I think we need to get much closer to. So I'm not making the case for regulating for the sake of regulating, but I'm making the case for basing selection of content that should be seen or taken down on very proper scrutiny, giving individuals the right to redress as they have in the offline world, and making sure that the rule of law is the basis for these kinds of decisions and not some kind of profit model or unknown decisions made by unknown algorithms.
Mm-hmm. So who and how, even if you accept all of that this is happening and this is so complex, who and how is a puzzle. I mean, we have to. It's not just a question of size. And Facebook and others talk about the numbers of people they're hiring now to play a certain oversight role. That's one kind of response. But with respect to, what parameters and who's looking at what those parameters are, do you have some guidance on how we advance a process to get to a reasonable outcome? Because, this is a crescendo. It's mounting around the world, and clearly these companies want to get in front of it. So how best to do that from your point of view?
So I really wish these companies want to get in front of it. I'm not convinced. And I'm sorry to say, because I've had this discussion with a lot of representatives of these big companies ahead of the presidential elections in this country about copyright law, which we're trying to reform in Europe. And I think a lot of them are only moving when their reputation is at stake. Suddenly a lot is possible. Somebody said to me the other day, and I thought this was really interesting, I haven't verified it myself, but it was a very interesting observation that apparently a lot of accounts that may have been bots or feeding automated messages suddenly disappeared in conjunction with a step in the Mueller investigation. So I guess there's more possible than has been done before. I think that's also what we're seeing. I mean, there's a lot of movement there, a lot of action suddenly taken by executives in these companies, and I really wish they would have appreciated the responsibility that comes with their power much earlier.
Yes, let me correct and say these companies should want to get in front of it. I certainly feel that's clear.
Yes, and I agree they should. I agree they should, and I think there's a lot more they can do. They can be more transparent about the decisions that their algorithms make. I think regulators need to have more insights into the intended use or impact of the intended outcome of algorithms, and then testing for the actual impact. So I'm not saying, and I also don't think it's likely that we should put all this code, out in the public. These are trade secrets. That's what these companies will hide behind. They'll say it's like the recipe of Coca-Cola. We can never give this away. But surely, even if we don't know the recipe of Coca-Cola, we can still see if it's poisonous. If it turns out that in a certain area a lot of people get ill after drinking it, something will happen. We don't know enough about the impact of code because it's so intransparent. So I think regulators need to know more about it. You can test them through deduction. So you could say, in a controlled environment, we're going to take an algorithm and we're going to push through data sets that we know and then see what comes out on the other end. I mean, there's a lot that you can do to have a better sense and for these companies to be more respectful of the rule of law. And I think also that they'll have to navigate some very difficult political choices. On the one hand, they want to do business in countries where there's no freedom of expression. On the other hand, they're not happy when they have to comply with the laws that limit the freedom of expression. I was moderating a panel at the Munich Security Conference with the chief security officer of Facebook, and I asked whether restrictive laws in a country had ever led them to not do business there. In other words, they simply don't want to put their users at risk by using Facebook so that they could later face, terrible consequences, which unfortunately speech still has in a number of countries in the world. And he, to the best of his knowledge, was not aware of Facebook choosing not to roll out in a certain country because of restrictive laws, but noted that it doesn't do business in China. But that, of course, is more a choice on the part of the government of China than it is on the part of the company of Facebook. So these companies will have to appreciate the sensitivities about, global business. There's a heated discussion about what role social media played in Myanmar, where there was a genocide, and how hate speech was spreading, rumors were spreading. I saw it with my own eyes in Kenya, where I was observing the elections, where, in a space where technology is still relatively young, where media literacy is an evolving field, and where rumors were shared in a very sophisticated way every day. Fake documents, allegedly coming from the UN or the International Republican Institute or European think tanks, alleging the most grave issues, and people getting very hyped up about it and possibly acting on it. We saw it happening here in DC when there was this notion of a criminal ring led by Hillary Clinton, and somebody took it upon himself. So the question of what information can lead to and the sensitivities about it, not only here, but also on the other end of the world, is something that I think deserves a lot more attention.
Well, you can come to Columbia any day of the week and there'll be a debate on these issues.
Good.
And really marvelous energy and interest, I think, on these questions, including at our journalism school, which is focused enormously on the fake news,
world famous
fake news questions, and asking how much of these lend themselves to technology-based solutions and how much do not, and just require different. These companies thinking themselves as media companies and a different set of responsibilities. It's a very active debate, I think, in this country. Let me just throw out one or two other subjects and then open it up, because we haven't gone there yet. And one of those, cybersecurity. And you've alluded to the fact that you would hope that the U.S. and Europe could develop more areas of cooperation. Cybersecurity, I would hope would be one of those areas. I know there have been efforts, kind of nascent efforts around norm building, and some bilateral treaties. And some of these treaties, I think, are fairly light touch treaties, but they say, no stealing for commercial purposes, or no disruption of data. And these are important. And maybe you could say there are some norms building. But as you think about the problem of cybersecurity and cooperation across jurisdictions, what do you see as the critical early steps, and particularly maybe between the U.S. and Europe, which are, one would hope, the most well aligned?
Yes. So if we look at the global perspective, and if we look at issues of stability and norms in peacetime and things like that, I think the thinking between the EU and the US is not as far apart as it is on issues like privacy, perhaps. So as a member of this Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, it's a commission with around 30 experts from completely different fields and different parts of the world. We think about norms. And in the past, international norms have emerged mostly when there was a mutual dependence, and where the actions of one could have, devastating impact on the other. Think about nuclear weapons, for example, non-proliferation. The idea that the responsibilities were so grave that it compelled countries, even if they didn't agree on anything, to engage in an agreement. So along the same lines, we've started thinking about where is the mutual dependence greatest, not only globally, but also between governments and the private sector. And when you peel off what the open internet really is and the global internet really is, at the very foundational level, you have sort of an infrastructural level. The domain name system, the routing, the whole way in which everyone, from a bank to a university to an average internet user, really is able to use the internet, depends much on the well-functioning of this infrastructure level. And so we are suggesting that what we call the public core of the open internet, this layer, could be an area around which a global norm could be developed, where states and other stakeholders agree that they will not attack on this layer or not harbor those who are attacking on this layer, because the issue of outsourcing responsibility is huge. Cyber mercenaries is what it's called, where essentially if a government simply allows a group of hackers to do the work for them, there will be fewer fingerprints, and they can say, well, the government of country X has never hacked A, B, or C, even though they may have knowingly harbored and facilitated these activities anyway. So hopefully the notion of mutual dependence on this layer of infrastructure is so great that it will bring people together to create a norm of hostility.
Non-interruption of infrastructure as one of those norms.
Yes, and there's also thinking in the direction of, for example, protecting of the running of the financial system.
Yes.
Because that's another area where there's such mutual dependence and where the impact could be devastating if banks don't work anymore, if international financial traffic doesn't work anymore. This is all heavily dependent on the well-functioning of a whole digital ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So the thinking is there, but it's still in the early stages. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, the EU and the US have been in the lead here and have established the notion that laws that apply offline should apply online, and that there are responsibilities, and also that increasingly there should be consequences when norms are breached or when attacks are waged.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me ask you one more trade question. And as someone who myself, I've worked in trade and in antitrust, and there's only rudimentary coverage in international trade rules on the digital economy, as you know, and very little, but some. In the WTO rules. So it's been bilateral treaties where we've seen the progress, and for the United States, the most advanced rendition was in the Trans-Pacific TPP that has not gone forward. And although some of those rules around no data localization and no access to source code and digital authentication and some of these things, the TPP countries, excluding the United States now, have gone forward with in an interesting way. Yeah. So I think you have indicated positive views around most of those provisions. Is that right? And where would you like those trade provisions to head?
It's a very interesting day to be talking about trade.
It is.
We've just heard that this administration of President Trump might actually impose tariffs on the import of steel and aluminum that could have devastating impact also in Europe. So let's see. I long back to the days where the EU and the US were in the lead of strengthening the rules-based system and the multilateral system, and I really think that that's what we need to do for rules on digital trade. So in the European Parliament, I actually initiated a resolution that was adopted with a broad majority that actually spells out what these rules should look like. Because indeed, when people think about trade, they often still think about container ships full of goods going all over the world, and how to make sure that these goods are safe and comply with all kinds of standards. But increasingly, actually, we're seeing what is called the servicification of trade. So it's a lot more about services, and then services are, of course, increasingly digital. So it's entirely possible for a professor to teach a class virtually on the other side of the world, for an architect to design a building at his or her computer in Amsterdam for a building in Tokyo. I mean, this global connectivity has real impact also on the kinds of jobs people do. And so in order to have a regulatory landscape where this data can be shared with clear rules of the road, where the flow of data can be free in principle, unless there's a good reason not to, we need a set of rules. And so indeed, I am in favor of the free flow of data, but I think it can only work if it goes hand in hand with clear data protection rules, because clearly we in Europe have thought about how that should be done in a proper manner, but the minute you start trading with another country, the question is, what kind of protection do you find on the other side? Mm-hmm. And so we usually rely on a notion that's called adequacy, so whether or not the rules on the other side are adequate for us to trade with. But what you want to avoid, on the other hand, is that the reason or the argument of data protection or privacy protection is invoked in order to keep markets closed. So you need a spelling out of what is legitimate and what is not legitimate to have as an exception to the free flow of data. And ideally, of course, these kinds of agreements should be made at the WTO, or globally at least. But in the absence of that, hopefully we can do that with like-minded countries. And we need to begin also in the European Union, where there are still issues with the free flow of data. So I think it's a hot topic that we need to make progress on. But again, and I hope that that's something that is also appreciated in the United States, it's very difficult to imagine smooth, free flow of data without data protection, also in other countries. And so as people here might sometimes criticize notions like the GDPR, you have to wonder how you can ask for the free flow of data if there's uncertainty about how this data is protected. And I'm convinced that more and more people also in the United States, consumers, are going to ask for that. Yeah. And that in turn may lead to innovation, etc. So let's see, I think Europe might not be in a bad place in taking a leadership role there also when it comes to digital trade.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. You know, sometimes I worry that, frankly, that these adequacy evaluations do have a political lens to them as well, that they're not purely empirical assessments of the resilience of the regime, because Europe has entered into adequacy evaluations with countries with very heterogeneous degrees of developed regimes. So how do you think the political lens enters into the adequacy evaluation?
So essentially what I think is necessary is to have transparent and predictable criteria. So that's also what we in the European Parliament asked for. We asked the European Commission, make it more clear and predictable what criteria you assess so that they become less political, of course. Because if it's clear up front what criteria a third country needs to meet in its laws to provide for adequacy, then you don't have that political
So the principle is a great one, but I fear both of our governments are not pristine in their
I don't think any of them are. That's true. And of course with trade, politics always plays a role, right?
Yeah,
trust in general and willingness in general, and sort of what trade-offs is one willing to make. And I think what we're talking about here is what bottom lines need to be preserved at a minimum level.
Absolutely. Well, I would love to keep going with you myself, but I feel obliged to open it up to those in the room, and those, I think, perhaps Hugo will help us with those online, or someone might as well. But let's open it up and see what questions we have with us. Would anyone? We have Professor Bradford, Anu Bradford.
Yeah, thank you, Marietje. So I wanted to follow up on that.
Thank you. So I wanted to follow up on a couple of themes that you touch upon. So one is the relationship between self-regulation of the industry and the government regulation, and in particular, if we think about the extent to which the European Union has chosen to pursue self-regulation when it comes to, say, removal of hate speech online. So I'm sympathetic to the skepticism that you have about outsourcing the regulation to the companies themselves. But what is the alternative? So if you think about it, at Facebook, I think they have something like 6,000 people reviewing those posts. So that's not something that the public institutions are capable of doing. So in the end, given the volume of this, we need to automate those solutions. They need to be done based on algorithms, and we have the incentive to leverage the technological know-how in those companies to try to come up with the way to effectively address the problem. So we do need to get them ahead of the problem and to want to regulate them effectively and efficiently. So I wanted to hear a little bit what the alternative would be if we wanted to have the government more involved. And I guess my broader question is more about then the relationship between the United States and the EU. And it may be somewhat provocative, but asking whether you would be comfortable endorsing the view that EU is a benevolent hegemon in this sphere, and we are, in a way, the EU is making up for some of the regulatory deficiencies when it comes to digital economy and technology. So when it comes to the US allowing for too much concentration. So it's the EU antitrust laws that really keep some of these tech companies in check. When it comes to privacy, the US just has been inadequate in delivering the kind of privacy protections, and even the US citizens depend on the EU in many ways, delivering them what their own government is not. The same thing that maybe we have gone too far in tolerating hate speech in this country. And in the end, it is the EU that is reining in some of the excesses in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Do we do one-on-one questions?
As you wish.
That's fine.
That was a rather large one,
yes.
So why don't we
I'd be happy
to.
I just wasn't sure if I should wait. Okay. Thank you for those two questions. I think it's of course necessary for tech companies to play a role in, monitoring and ensuring that the laws apply on their platforms. But the question is, how do we know what the criteria are? And I'm mostly concerned about the lack of oversight. So about the sort of free hand that the companies get with an approval of, for example, the European Commission here. Because let's not think only about this in terms of regulation versus self-regulation. There's a very thin line that allows these companies to preserve the claim of intermediary liability exception. I don't know if you all are aware, but both in American law and European law, part of e-commerce is a safeguard for online platforms that they are not liable. You also touched upon the question, are these media companies or not?
Sure.
And that's a big discussion at the journalism school. They benefit enormously. In fact, they depend, these tech companies, on the intermediary liability exception. The notion that if I sell you a car on eBay and you find out later that it was stolen, that is not eBay's responsibility but mine, right? That's the notion, and the same goes for speech, so that companies like YouTube or Facebook or Twitter don't have to know all the content before it's uploaded. And that's a huge element that allows for e-commerce to flow. On the other hand, filtering terrorist content, filtering fake news, filtering hate speech, filtering content over which copyright has not been paid for, are all eating away at this exception. And so they have to be framed in a very clear exception to the exception to be legal. Because I think, and I really hope that legal experts will look at this, it's becoming increasingly tense to claim on the one hand that they don't have editorial responsibility, while in fact they're editing the whole day. And they may be editing for profit one day, they may be editing to preserve the rule of law the other day. But is the line blurring? Will companies be overly ambitious to take down content out of fear of getting fined? So they may start sweepingly taking down content preventively out of fear of letting too much content online, keep allowing it to be uploaded. So the question is, how do we make sure that the compliance is in line with the letter of the law and that the oversight serves the public interest? Those are my key questions that I think are brushed over in the interest of doing something, because indeed, the field that we're talking about, the impact on democracy, on our safety, on children's safety, is understandably leading to a sense of urgency to do something. But the push of responsibility into these private sector hands without thinking about where the regulators come in and what someone can do when their content is illegitimately taken down, what the slippery slope might be between now and 10 years out of doing this now, I think are questions that deserve more attention. Second question is the EU benevolent hegemon. Maybe that's a little bit too much credit, because I really think that the EU is focusing, perhaps too much even, but on what it should do for its own citizens. And it has the side effect that, for example, developing economies tend to look at EU law and in the interest of gaining access to the European market, they will comply to make it easier to gain that access, or they will simply benefit from the exercise of crafting these laws and adopt them. But I don't think it is the explicit intention to really push it out, except with the GDPR, of course. The idea is that it should apply for EU citizens wherever the data is stored, routed, processed, etc. But this extraterritoriality is also happening on the part of American companies. I mean, the whole idea is really that we've seen the Justice Department asking for information of European users and others through these platforms that operate worldwide. So the question of jurisdiction and territoriality, extraterritoriality, norm setting by private sector actors or by governments is seen in a multi-layered way in every aspect of the global internet. It's not just the EU. I think you can peel it off almost everywhere. And so the question is, will this lead to governance through norms based on clear values that should apply globally, or will it sort of be a survival of the fittest, where companies move as far as they can until they hit a legislative wall, so to say, and governments trying to catch up with the speed with which these technologies move. And I think governance will take different shapes. It will be more multi-stakeholder, but then if it is multi-stakeholder, as in the case of taking down content, where's the accountability? So I think we have a lot of work to do to balance that out and to create the proper checks and balances and oversight mechanisms.
Well, I would say that whether benevolent or not, I wouldn't conclude, but I would say that the European regulatory model is being exported more aggressively than the US regulatory model in area after area. And so as I travel the world, I see countries around the world that pattern their antitrust on the EU model, and securities regulation increasingly influenced. And so I'm fully expecting to see mini GDPRs develop around the world. I just don't know what I think about it yet.
But is it an export or is it a gravity point? That's what because I don't really see the sort of export promotion so much, but maybe that's because I'm in the bubble.
Well, I think some of these other areas, actually, you've had a lot of European investment in technical assistance to developing countries, influencing. In this latest example, I can't speak to that.
No, that makes
I
sense.
think Jason Healy has a question.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to pull the thread, because you'd mentioned the EU-Russia meeting that you just came from, and maybe you could talk a little more about that. I'm particularly interested in opportunities for more transatlantic work, for carrots and sticks on Putin's behavior, the appetite for Europe for continuing or further sanctions. And here in the U.S., the investigation has really been driving a lot, I think, of some of the understanding. Is there scope for Europe for such an investigation, maybe without the law enforcement aspect, hopefully? Thank you.
Thank you. So I wish we had a whole event to talk about Russia and EU and US responses, but EU-Russia relations were the theme of the seminar that my political group hosted yesterday in the European Parliament and that I was asked to chair. And so essentially what we did as a political group is lay out a vision of how we can engage Russia despite the enormous difficulties that the Kremlin is presenting us. Violations of international law, illegal annexation of Crimea, fueling of the war in Syria, in eastern Ukraine, repression of dissent at home, stifling of speech. The list is too long, unfortunately. And of course, we also see an attempt to influence the EU from within. We see people like Viktor Orban with his so-called illiberal democracy vision, hugging very close to the Putins of this world. A nationalist leader of the so-called Freedom Party from the Netherlands was just visiting Putin and proudly sharing pictures of the constructive conversations they've had. So the nationalists are often inspired by his nationalist and sort of, top-down, anti-Muslim, countering terrorism kind of style. I think we are at a fragile point in the European Union when it comes to this, because a lot of decisions, such as the extension of sanctions, have to be made unanimously and each 6 months. So counter to what people may think, that sanctions apply until they are ended, they actually only apply for a set period of 6 months each time, and they have to be unanimously prolonged each time. Now, the glass is half full when we consider the fact that that has happened each half year so far. The challenge is with every renewal that comes after new elections in Europe. Italy is having elections soon. It will be really important to see what comes out of there. I'm aware of the delicate balance that we still have within the European Union. I think the meddling in the democratic processes is something to look at, but to also look at carefully so that it doesn't become a blanket reason for everything that people worry about. You know, oh, it must have been Russian interference, because attempts at interfering and winning hearts and minds have been of all ages. If it is so successful now, let's ask ourselves, let's ask ourselves how we can make our own democracies more resilient. Why do people mistrust anything from experts to political parties to the mainstream media? Why are they more inclined to buy into a narrative of someone who is blatantly hostile to our way of life, to our democracy? These are questions that I think tend to be overshadowed by the notion of, Russian bots on social media and whatnot. So I think it's important to peel it all off. And that's what we try to do in that seminar. I don't know what else I can say about it. I would hope that we can work together with the United States on this, because we are, essentially open societies that are under pressure. And I think it cannot be overestimated the extent to which democracies, civil society, liberalism is under pressure globally. We can really not even afford the kind of transatlantic rift that is emerging as we speak, with the sort of unpredictable and America first kind of policies that are coming out of the White House. I'm deeply concerned about it. I'm deeply concerned about it because it comes right at the time where we need to look at other global players and what their interests are versus our interests. And Russia is one example. China is another obvious example. We have problems with Turkey. We have Gulf states that are allowing state aid to sort of poison a lot of economic sectors. It's hard to make trade rules with countries like India. So we have a lot of things to work on together, and it's a distraction in many ways that we are not on one line at all times.
Mm-hmm. It's absolutely the case. And has been for some time that these tensions, I think our tensions between the U.S. and Europe have been as great as sometimes our tensions with other countries where, the systems are more fundamentally different.
But sometimes I wonder, because I agree with you, whether it's also because we are so open. I mean, we can talk to each other. We fly across the Atlantic all the time. Mm-hmm. And then we can really go into great detail about the issues that we would like to see improved. We have high expectations of each other. And so we're very disappointed if those expectations are not met. I remember well the response in Europe to the pivot to Asia by President Obama, President Obama was immensely popular in Europe, but this whole pivot to Asia almost broke the hearts of some Europeans. They're going to look another way? What? And so I think part of what we're seeing is because we know each other so well, because we can talk to each other, because we are in so frequent conversations, that we also see the differences. I mean, we're hardly talking about the governance that China has on the open internet and how it undermines the open character, how it doesn't allow for market access by both European and American companies, how human rights online are heavily repressed, how there's this social credit system that is going to really take stock of every step that a Chinese person takes. I mean, maybe this is the bigger issue we should be addressing, but instead, I talk a lot more, at least maybe it's my professional bubble, but about the differences between the EU and the US. And so hopefully we cannot lose sight of that bigger global dynamic and the pressure that also exists on fundamental freedoms and liberal democracy online.
Well, I think you should get Europe to push for a new transatlantic trade agreement with new energy and see what happens. I invite you to see how far we can get, because every administration needs to feel ownership of the negotiations, in this area. I think and particularly it seems this one doesn't want to take up something that came before. So maybe if they start something fresh, you can add your own character to it and achieve more.
You know what? I mean, I wish we could continue to talk about a transatlantic trade and investment partnership also with an eye on the digital economy, but I'm afraid that anything that comes from this administration is so toxic in Europe right now. I mean, trade was not exactly a harmonious discussion before. I mean, we saw lots of demonstrations and questions about TTIP anyway, also under Obama. So I think the EU's position on the ambition to have a comprehensive trade and investment partnership with the US has not changed. I think what has changed is the administration of this country in quite radical forms when it comes to trade. I don't know, I mean, you've worked at USTR and you know the field better than I do, but I was at USTR a couple of weeks ago and I felt like I was in a twilight zone.
Well, that's another subject. But one I would welcome also discussing. You know, I feel that you know, this issue has gotten more and more polarizing in the United States. It has not just started with this president. This president is really amplifying the tensions that have been in our country for a long time, and then specific actions that he's taking, you know, some of which I deeply regret, and others which I think would have happened under any. So it's a bigger conversation. Yep. I think if I may collect a couple more questions and comments, if I could here and then here, please.
Thanks, Tom. You referred to Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, and his speech in Munich, I think, Security Council, the Security Munich Summit. So when do you think this argument and discussion about norms and regulations of the internet feasibly will take place at the UN? Because we know that there's a lot of divisions among member states, and it's almost off the table.
Yeah.
How realistic and when do you think it will come to that table?
Yeah. May I collect one or two others? And I think Hugo, and then over here. Yep.
There's a lady in the back as well.
Thank you.
Or two people in the back. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a quick question, and actually related to on the trade issue. One of the things that's blocking, I think, the EU-US relation is internal politics, as you've both said, and we haven't indulged in EU politics very much. So I'm going to ask you a question on that. And the question is really how much trade is one of these issues. How much do you think? I come from France, where trade, especially the past couple of years, has been increasingly polarized, and a lot of French people were opposed to signing a treaty with the U.S. or with other countries. So my question is, what is the role of the European level there between France and the U.S. on the other side? There's bilateral relations, obviously, between member states and the U.S. But how do we make the European level work in favor of having a better transatlantic relationship? Because that seems. That has seemed very hard, and it does seem like still today it's being used by some, not all, but some politicians nationally in Europe to kind of shift the blame from their own mistakes to European politicians who are, you know, as you said, far away in Brussels. So I'm just my question is, how can the European level be efficient and useful in fostering a better relationship instead of used on a national level?
So, may we collect one more from the back?
Yes.
Yeah, please. The lady in the back. Could we start with the lady in the back?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Tom. So you mentioned the issue of transparency, which is included in the GDPR as the right to explanation. And I think that is a particularly important issue to discuss. Yet the GDPR is a little bit ambiguous about what this means and how to be implemented. There is an ongoing debate about the role of different stakeholders in sharing the responsibility for increasing transparency. So my question is, how would you define the right to explanation, and how do you see its implementation? Thank you.
Should we give you a moment there, or keep going with questions?
We can keep going, it's fine.
Okay. Then,
I'm writing now, so don't worry.
There's a gentleman. Thank you.
One of the major issues in the area of digital area is the taxation of companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook. Fortunately, EU has taken a lead, and with the last conference in Tallinn, they have been moving forward for the taxation and having a common consolidated corporate tax base. But many of the countries in EU itself, like specifically, Amsterdam also, Netherlands also, not being very enthusiastic, with having a centralized system of taxation. Do you see that this common consolidated corporate tax base coming into force? And in case if it's not coming into force, do you see that major countries like France and Germany probably going alone and stopping many businesses of many of these companies like Amazon?
Sorry, I think I overlooked you over here. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. My name is Chris Mondini. I have two pretty quick questions. They might require a longer answer. We talked about norm setting and establishing global ideas of minimally accepted norms, and I know there are many dialogues and multi-stakeholder gathering points. You mentioned the United Nations in particular, but are there other fora, some are informal, some are more formal, but where do you see solutions emerging? And my second question concerns, if you consider maybe the younger citizens of Europe. I know over the years there's been talk of a democratic deficit, and that Brussels doesn't always feel like a place where Europeans look to that's looking out for their interests. And yet many of the internet-enabled online platforms, businesses, services are so ingrained in the lives of young people, the way they work, the way they study, the way they socialize, the way they communicate. Have the same guiding concerns about protecting citizens? Is that diminished at all in younger generations as their lives are supported by these internet-enabled organizations?
Mm-hmm.
Please, I think we should give her a chance.
Yes. Thank you for all your questions. With regard to the UN, I can't speak for the UN. I was mostly observing it as an interesting new priority, apparently, for the UN. But I'll be hoping to learn more tomorrow when I actually go and visit. And I hope that it wasn't just the eagerness to mention cyber without a clear plan, because sometimes pulling something into the UN is more of a risk than a help. Because the balance of the democracies of this world is not necessarily in our favor, so to say. Yes, a lot of questions about the transatlantic relation, the notion of shifting the blame. It also kind of relates to your question to quote-unquote Brussels, the European level. This is something that's been going on for a while. But specifically when it comes to the added value of the EU, I think it's good to know that trade is actually an exclusive competence to a large extent of the EU level. So there's a mandate given with unanimity by the governments of member states. So that's a moment where parliaments should send their ministers with a clear mandate to give that European-wide mandate to the European Commission to then negotiate. The European Parliament approves or disapproves, and again the member state governments approve or disapprove. So on trade, there's European added value, and I think it's working quite well. I think on technology, you see transatlantically that the discussion is maturing. A couple of years ago, I noticed that whenever I went to Silicon Valley or talked to people in the US, there was a lot of talk about the fact that the EU was over-regulating, that people were hysterical or emotional about the right to privacy and other fundamental rights. Now, we have discussions about substance. What's working, what's not working, how can we make it better? So I do see maturing, and I think that that's a positive sign. Another area which I'm sure we can't talk about in detail today, but I just wanted to flag anyway, is the whole question of defense cooperation. It's something that we take very seriously in Europe. On the other hand, we hear, first we heard from the US invest more in defense, which I think is a perfectly legitimate ask in the context of NATO and otherwise. But now that it's happening, there's concern that it would compete with NATO, which I don't think is anyone's intention. So I think some people felt a bit like damned if we do, damned if we don't, and that's an unfortunate dynamic about something that I think should bring us closer together. Yes, then with regard to the GDPR and how it will actually enter into force, I think we'll have to see, how it's going to be interpreted and how that's going to lead to perhaps challenges before courts or next steps being spelled out in practice. So I think it's too early to say now how it will be interpreted, but that's something that we'll look forward to with great interest, of course. The question of taxation, yes, a very hot topic, and it's really, I think, a cultural change that we see in many societies, because a lot of the practices and the agreements that these big tech companies have benefited from were not illegal, but the morality is really questioned now, and therefore you see all kinds of initiatives. I mean, in my own country, there's a scrutiny of tax deals that have been made, and it's questioned whether they've been done properly and whether they should continue. And indeed, you mentioned the common corporate tax base as a new way to really look at where profit has been made and where taxation might take place. So we're expecting a new plan by the OSCE in the spring, and also new proposals on the European level that are coming. And there's a big discussion between whether revenue or profit should be taxed. President Macron has suggested revenue should be taxed, and that's quite controversial. It's also not how the OSCE looks at it. So I'm sure there'll be some kind of heated political debate about what the best solution is. But I think this is really also represents a shifting in the expectations and the morality of deals that have long perhaps not been so controversial, or at least not part of the public debate to the extent that they are now. And essentially with tech companies, this will become a more important question, because in the past, goods were somewhere. They were sold somewhere. It was more clear that they were changing hands. And now it's much more a question of added value, where R&D is taking place and how that should work. So I think that's a field that we'll see a lot of movement in soon. Then the question about norms as well, and where else but at the UN these might take shape. I think one obvious place would be, if it would work better, is the WTO, but also the Council of Europe. We still have, for example, the Budapest Convention, which is holding despite a lot of political tensions otherwise. And the EU is, of course, still transnational level where decisions are being made. But what I'm guessing and curious about is that there might be an evolving towards more multi-stakeholder norms. So perhaps a gravitation around private sector and government cooperation. I mean, we already see Alibaba announcing online free trade zones, right? Companies making laws, essentially, or setting norms. Not exactly the kind of public oversight that I prefer to see, but it's certainly a development. We hear a company like Microsoft asking for Geneva Convention Online, which sounds very nice, but is not exactly the same as saying laws that apply offline apply online as well. And it goes against some of the initiatives that are already going on, so I think it's worrying. But we see a real push, in other words, from the private sector to actually look at these transnational norms. And it's almost a signal like, if you guys, policymakers don't do it, then we'll do it ourselves. And I think what will end up happening is that there will be questions about governance on certain norms where private sector and governments and hopefully civil society, which I think is so important here, the technical experts, the human rights community can come together and agree. And also then agree what compliance means and what the consequences of non-compliance should be. Because too often we say there's a norm. For example, everybody will probably agree that a cyber attack is illegal, but they happen all the time and there's hardly ever any consequences. Then you talked about the youth and the democratic deficit. It's really hard for me to reflect on the democratic deficit when at the same time I get thousands of emails about specific topics all the time. So my experience is when we talk about the EU and governance of the Eurozone or institutional reform, people, especially young people, check out very soon. But when we talk about scholarships to study abroad, about net neutrality and rules of the road online, taxation of tech companies, animal welfare, environmental protection, common defense policy, then it gets much more tangible for people. Pensions we're talking about now. So to make it as specific as possible usually helps. And I don't think it's a coincidence that someone like Marietje Schaake, the Commissioner for Competition and Antitrust Policies, is one of the most popular politicians in Europe. And she manages to reach people across borders. I think a lot of young people see her as an inspiring leader. One, because of her style. She's very open. She communicates very easily, and she takes the time to do so, to reach out to people and to empower them in their own way. But two, she also makes policies that people think are relevant. She, as this liberal female politician, stands up to the big companies with the authority of the European Union based on thorough research, and she can slap fines on anything from Gazprom to Google. I mean, that commands respect.
Let's see if there are any more questions. Collect one or two, and I might have throw one in as well. Over here.
Yeah, so I want to talk about China a bit. In the US, in the past couple of years, there have been a lot of concerns about Chinese tech companies, specifically Huawei and ZTE. There's been some that Huawei tried to introduce a cell phone in the United States a couple months ago, and apparently congressional leaders decided that that wasn't a good idea and told AT&T to not have Huawei sell the cell phone. There's also been concerns with respect to foreign investment of tech company, Chinese buying foreign investment in the United States, and I was just wondering whether these same concerns exist in Europe, and if so, what's being done about it?
Mm-hmm.
Right up here.
Yeah. I come from the eastern part of the European Union, Bulgaria, but my question is, what you talked about the 28 countries, which actually soon will be 27, so it seems like, is the European Union actually going to try to expand and include the Western Balkans, which remains one of the zones of pretty big tension, and how do you deal with the countries that are, or the cultures, I would say, not countries, but the cultures that are not sharing necessarily the, so to speak, the old European Union values. Like, for example, the refugees is a big topic, and you see such a big difference between the attitude of, say, Germany to put it there, Bulgaria, Hungary. So what's your thinking, and what are your colleagues in the European Parliament thinking about it?
Mm-hmm. No more questions? Right? Oh. Sorry, didn't see you.
In the opening, you mentioned the Cloud Act, and I'm curious to ask, do you see a collision coming in May? Let's argue that the Cloud Act is passed. It has very good bipartisan support. The Judicial Redress Act is already re-energized. So suppose that legislation comes to be in the United States as enacted, and then in May 18th the GDPR lands. Do you see a collision there, and what kind of collision? What would be the issues?
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you had a chance to see the transcript, but we had a historic case at the Supreme Court of US v. Microsoft just 2 days ago. Mm-hmm. Transcripts, I think, are available. There was some discussion at that hearing around whether a judicial versus a legislative response, was appropriate and its consequences. So, there's a lot going on there.
Yes, there is. Okay. The whole area of backdoors, poorly constructed mobile devices or networks, intentionally or unintentionally, and the risk is certainly a topic in Europe. And I actually want to take a small parallel step because it's quite unfortunate, I think, that the discussion about the safety of consumer devices starts because of a certain product from a certain brand from a certain country, because it should be of broad concern all the time. And in that sense, I think regulation, it can be a good thing. If you have minimum standards about the Internet of Things or other devices that they need to meet before they can enter the market, then it doesn't become so diplomatically tense to say those companies from China may have a problem, right? Because I'm convinced they're not the only ones. So I think, yes, the question of how to deal with outdated software running on devices, with smart and connected devices, with backdoors that are installed for one or the other reason is a very, very important one and should be held broadly and not narrowly, essentially. And we are having it in Europe, also about foreign direct investment. You may be aware of a discussion that's going on now of trying to coordinate the foreign direct investment screening of, for example, Chinese investments into strategic technology companies more effectively. It's not binding, so it's not going to be one harmonized screening criterion for all of the EU, but it's supposed to be an incentive for member states to share experiences so that any foreign direct investor cannot go hopping between different member states and get different outcomes. Yeah, definitely, jurisdiction shopping. And the challenge here is, of course, and that relates back to a number of areas, that national security is a national competence. So it's 28 different visions on what national security is, and it's already allowed to block a foreign investment for national security reasons. But of course, the weighing of the significance of the risk might be different in 28 different countries. So the question is, how do you square that with a single market and a regulatory level playing field? Then on the Balkans, yes, I'm so glad you brought it up. It's a very important focus, and I'm glad that the taboo of accession of the Western Balkans has been passed, because Juncker, you may recall at the beginning of this term, said for the next 5 years there will be no enlargement, which it sounded strong and meaningful for one press release, but clearly the impact that it had in the Western Balkans is that the ambition to reform was diminished, the influence from other global players not so far away increased, whether it was Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China. And this is a very big problem because the Western Balkans remain too fragile. And we all have a big debt to that region. I mean, I started my career as a fellow at the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, looking at war crimes, and it's still unacceptable and unbelievable to me that at less than 2-hour flight from Amsterdam, neighbors were killing each other in the way that they were, and it took so long for Europe to play an active role to bring back the peace. And I hope those painful lessons are still fresh in our memories and not to repeat them. You also touched upon the challenge of different views on refugees between Eastern and Western. I think the challenge is that there's different views on a number of issues. Rule of law in a country like Poland and Hungary. What solidarity mean, I think, at large is a very, very prominent question. So we see increasingly that countries want to cherry pick. They want the benefits of the union. For example, cohesion funds, a lot of money is flowing from, roughly speaking, Europe into Southeastern Europe. And I think it's hard for us to explain to our citizens why that, if the notion of sharing the responsibility and actually the agreement of redistributing refugees, people that have the right to asylum when they're fleeing the most devastating war, is not honored. And the talks are now going in the direction of punishing through cohesion funds. So whether there should be consequences if a country doesn't want to uphold its agreements. I think it's quite controversial. I hope we don't have to go there. But at some point, I think it's stretched to the limits that a country, on the one hand, doesn't accept the rules it has signed up to. Look at Poland. And on the other hand, if there's no consequences, then the whole core of what membership of the European Union actually is starts to erode. So I expect this will be a big discussion during the next elections as well. Yeah. So that the Cloud Act would be actually in violation of the Privacy Shield more than the GDPR. And I don't know the details enough to be sure about that now. I think on the one hand, legal certainty can help, but I believe it's important also that there's consideration of the individual's rights and not just government access to data. And I think that's where the tension might emerge. At the same time, this whole MLAT process that we have now is also not fit for purpose. I'm happy if access to information by law enforcement is framed in law, but the question is whether it provides adequate protection of the individual. And then I have not had a chance, unfortunately, actually, to read the transcript of the Supreme Court, but I would love to. Maybe somebody can share a few points from it, but I can't really comment on it because I haven't read it yet. Sorry.
No, I wasn't suggesting. I just wanted to alert you that it's available.
Yes,
and it's
I
important.
should look at it.
What a fantastic conversation. I want to give you an open invitation to come back anytime. We want you to come back soon.
Thank you so much.
Please join me in thanking our very distinguished guest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
That was wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much. Good questions.